Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I have me a very special guest, JD Evans. JD, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Oh, excellent, excellent. Like I said before we got recording, I haven't talked to anybody in writing in 2 weeks. My two best friends and my wife are tired of it, so it'll be nice to get to talk to somebody who actually knows what's going on. And we'll actually start with that first one right there. What has your writing journey been like up until this point?
I think it probably sounds a lot like most writers. I started when I was a kid because I liked to read, and
Mm.
I wrote the same things that I read. And I got into fantasy as a preteen teenager, things like Tamara Pierce and
Ooh.
Dragonlance
Oh,
and
yeah.
kind of the classics. And I don't know, a couple years ago, I had just had my first kid and I was at home with him, and I just really wanted something to do besides just be a mom. And so I started working on a project I've been working on for a while, which ended up being Rain and Ruin, and which is my first book. And my sister had actually self-published
Oh,
a few years before me.
oh,
She
that's
wrote
cool.
middle grade fantasy.
Mm.
And so she'd been like preaching the self publishing route forever, and I still wasn't really on board with it yet. And then I just knew, I was like, you know what, even if I can query this and get an agent, and it's going to take years before I
Yeah.
ever get this thing published. And so I was just basically impatient, and so I started the process of publishing it. And at the time I was really which was when I started, so like 2018ish. I was like really into the groups where they push the kind of fast publication
Mm.
schedule. And so in my head, I was gonna like speed publish this epic fantasy series. And I got through the first three books and completely burned out because they're big chonky
Yeah.
books. And you can't really write at the same speed as some other genres, where you're a slightly smaller book,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
it's a little less world building and so. But yeah, that's how I got where I am now.
So funny that you mentioned that because I have a friend who was trying to do the same thing for Epic Fantasy. He got through his first chonker. I told him, I was like, I think you could kill someone with this book. And I was like, afterwards, I asked him, I was like, are you gonna rapid release book two? He goes, I need like a year off. And
Yeah.
I just thought it was funny. And yeah, and we were just talking about that with another author the other day of like, trying to decide. Like I actually kind of paused my fantasy series because it seemed like my urban fantasy, I had just figured out a lot of world building problems. And I'm
Mhm.
like, well, I just kind of feel like, because you're in the real world, most of the time, I'm like, there were certain things I had to learn because he's like an ex-Marine and stuff, but it
Yeah.
was just kind of a lot easier, to just kind of go. So
Faster to
yeah,
write.
it's just, no
Yeah.
offense, to anybody, but I think certain genres are faster to write. I just think that epic fantasy in particular, it's like, especially with expectations today, I definitely think, not to discourage anybody, but I have a friend who he's just so good at that and his world building is really good. And I've spoken to several female authors recently where they just write very quickly for epic
Yeah.
fantasy. I think I'm a lot slower at fantasy than other genres in terms of writing. But yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I think it also can really depend on if you're somebody that's very good at plotting and
Yeah. Yep.
plot really heavily and then just sit down for those 5-10,000 word days. If you are more of a pantser, which is what I am, and a lot of my friends that write the epic fantasy sort of intuit this story, that takes a lot longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not because it's better, just because it's more disorganized, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So,
No, totally. Yeah.
yeah.
Why to like think I told my best friend this the other day, he's like, how because we just saw him for our like our gender reveal party. So we were discussing this and he was like really interested. He's like, so when are you gonna I'm like, I don't know. I was like, I just think I need to get better at plotting because I like got done with this first draft and then I got halfway through the second one. I was like, I still don't like this. And I think it just really I agree with you. I think it comes down to plotting. And I think it is I think if you're not really organized with it at the start, I do think it's like a skill you have to develop over time. But I also find it kind of hard because it's like as a natural discovery writer, I think it's harder to plot but I want to, and I know like Rob J. Hayes talks about that a lot on their podcast for his Wizards, Warriors, and Words, how, he's gotten a lot better at plotting, and I'm trying.
Yeah.
I'm trying.
Yeah. I think, I think I've gotten better at it just out of necessity, because
Mm,
as you move into a big series, you start to lose track of threads,
yeah.
and you can't really, I got through books 1 through 3 without a ton of plotting,
Mm,
but I have 3 more to go.
yeah,
And
yeah.
if I don't start tracking some stuff, and I think too, just trying to like strengthen my craft and make sure that I'm hitting necessary things. And I've gotten better at it, but it is still very much a hybrid system. It's very loose. It's not, some people, they plot. They've
Yeah,
got
yeah,
color coded stickies. They've got,
yeah.
and mine's more like just sort of a running beat sheet. So, and I, I think that's fine. You, as you go through writing, you find that happy medium that works for
Yeah.
you. And I think most writers continue to change as they
Yeah.
go, find new systems, find new methods, try different things.
Yeah, I think that's just a really great tip is like, and we've said that a lot on here is like, if you are using something and it's working, like, keep using it. But at the same time, I think we all worry, right, that we're not going to find the next new thing that helps us even further.
The
Like,
magic pill that
yeah.
makes it all easy somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, like I re-listened to the Will White like Cradle series to get caught back up to Skysworn, and I was just teasing my buddy about this because he just got done with Dread God, like book 11 or whatever. And he was like, don't you just wish as a writer you could like take an elixir and just be better organized, like be a plotter? And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, I so wish that I could do that, particularly with plotting, because it's just
I would
not my strong.
sell my soul to be
Yeah,
organized. But
right.
yeah, just
That's
to
what
just
my, yeah, no, that's really funny. That'd make a great story, like somebody selling their soul to be a better plotter, like a writer. That would be awesome. There you go, our crowd. That'll be the first story idea that comes from this podcast. That's
there you
awesome.
go.
All right, well, we'll get to that second one there.
Okay.
What are your Mages of the Wheel books about, and how did you come up with this idea?
So they're an epic fantasy, and they're set in an Ottoman inspired setting.
Oh,
Um,
that's awesome.
yeah. So
I teach history, so that's like I like that time period in
I
particular.
love ancient history. I've always loved it. About the time you hit the Middle Ages, I lose interest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I love it all. Yeah, so I was in the Army, the US
Oh,
Army,
cool.
almost 10 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And part of that was a year-long trip where I was in Jordan, um, Qatar, and Lebanon. And I was at the embassy in Lebanon.
Oh, cool.
And speaking of ancient history, Lebanon is
Yeah,
the Levant is just this incredible place that's been through all the empires. It's
yeah,
been
yeah.
all the things. There's one spot there that is it's been the only place in the world that's been continuously occupied for something like 10,000 years. So
Yeah,
it's insane, right? And it's beautiful, and it's a Mediterranean country. I know if I say Lebanon, most people think Beirut, and in the US that conjures a really specific image,
yeah, yeah.
but there's a lot more, as with most places, to it than that. And I just really fell in love with the area and the people there. They're very warm, very kind, just fun people. And because I like ancient history, I just wanted to write a fantasy that was in a different setting than
Yeah.
maybe Europe, partly out of laziness. I didn't, if I was going to research something, I wanted to be interested in it. And I just have
Yeah.
never been interested in medieval Europe, just not very much at
It's been
all.
done so much. It's been
Yeah.
overdone. It's been overdone so much. Sorry, everybody. Not that
Yeah,
come
well,
up with
it
a
has.
story, but
And you also have to be careful. I mean, that's not my culture.
yeah,
The
yeah,
least. So I did depart away from like the religious backgrounds and things that I just don't personally have the depth of,
Mm.
but the, like the clothing and the food and the environment and some of the things that were happening in the Ottoman Empire around about the time of Suleiman, like
Mm.
uh just that was the inspiration. So
Cool.
it is a romance series, and it each book focuses on a different set of two people, but they feed into this overarching plot of essentially saving their homeland and magic and kind of rebalancing. Their religion is based on a wheel,
Oh,
and the wheel, the spokes represent the different like elements of magic, and
oh, that's cool.
there's a theme of like balance in the books, and yeah, so that's where it came from.
Oh, that's really neat. I like that. I always like the wheel of time. Like I just like that concept. And I'm like totally blanking right now because we just looked it up in my summer school class, which if it's like Zoroastrianism, I'm forgetting which one, but I know we just studied a major religion and I was like sitting there talking with the kids and I was like, oh, a wheel. And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, this is where Robert Jordan got this idea from. And
Yeah,
I was just
exactly.
so much more interested then. I was like, oh, that's really cool. But yeah, that's super cool. Well, I didn't know that. I just think it's interesting with the time period that you picked because um I just feel like, yeah, like I used to write a lot of like medieval Europe stuff, and I was like, this just isn't my thing. And I think it's because I like you, like the Muslim caliphates to me are very interesting, and the Mongols and things. And I actually really after this summer, I'm like, I really got into Mongols, and I like really, really want to do like a Mongol fantasy now. I think that would just be like so cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different time periods now, particularly with fantasy. Like I just got done with H.M. Long's Hall of Smoke, and I just loved what she did. Like she took like a Viking like culture, I would say, but like completely changed it. It was so unique and it was so fresh. It was just really cool. So when you say that, that to me was really interesting. And I was going through, your blurbs. I love your covers, by the way. They're some of my favorites that I've seen. And I've talked to several people, several authors, and some readers on Twitter too that are just like, oh, these books, and especially the covers that just like draw you in. So I always look at cover, blurb, and then reviews. But I was very pleasantly surprised, reading your reviews. I was like, oh, this is like definitely like I just thought I was just talking to my wife about your books in particular because how you have done, and I talk about this a lot, like in terms of like, coming up with your brand. I just felt like you did a really good job coming up with your brand. And I like it because it's like especially with your covers and your branding, like it seems like it's just very unique. It's fresh. I just really got into I think I bought the first three. But I just got really into, just reading the reviews in particular about your world, and your characters. And it just really seemed like, it's particularly what readers really wanted within the genre. And it just seemed really well done. And I was telling my wife, I was like, this is how I want to do things. Like this is, and I was like having random covers and things and or not good
It's
blurbs, it's just
yeah, so blurbs are, oh my gosh. But yeah, finding the balance between getting a cover that's to market and that
yeah.
the exact same as every other cover is very difficult.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
at the time when I picked those covers, well, the artist is Tatiana Honor,
Oh
and
wow.
she's just incredibly talented, but
Yeah.
obviously. So I so in fantasy romance there was a very specific kind of cover. It was a
Yeah.
couple, and one of the issues I was running into is that fantasy romance has a lot of YA in it, and there's not a ton of line between fantasy romance that's YA or generally considered maybe clean. It's going to have closed door scenes and
Yeah.
less violence and profanity, and an adult or a new adult. But the covers, there's like no different to indicate what people are getting into. And, people do not like to be
Interesting.
with sex scenes.
Yeah, yeah. Huh.
I don't surprise anybody that way. That's
Yeah.
not the plot twist I'm going for.
Yeah.
So I looked at covers and they were generally kind of dark and they had the couple, and I knew I wanted like that classic illustrated fantasy look that gets very expensive very fast.
Mm.
And I just had this idea that it would be really cool and it would stand out if my covers were black and white or really low saturation color. And I just did like a search on Pinterest to get inspiration. I just put in black and white covers, and what popped up was a lot of Tanya's like fan art.
Mm.
And I chatted with her about it, and she is my brand basically. Yeah, so there you go. There's a story that you didn't ask for of my cover.
Actually, I was gonna ask you later anyway. It's part one
Yeah.
of my part two of one of the questions for later. But yeah, I was just like, dang. Well, I just was curious. I guess we can get to it now. Like, I just was curious, like, in terms of like, because I always find this interesting because you did this. Oh my gosh, and I'm totally blanking on um Sandra L. Rosarella, she did this too, where there were Cecilia covers where they matched, and she did like a black, I think it's a black and red, a black and blue, and a black and white, I believe. And they just look so good sitting, side by side. So I was
Yeah.
curious if she kind of had that idea, right off the bat. Like for your covers, did you have that idea that you were gonna, want them to match, or did that come later?
So yeah, I definitely wanted, I knew a couple of things I wanted. I wanted them to look nice standing next to each other.
Oh
And
yeah.
the colors are representative of the houses of magic. So
Oh,
like,
that's cool.
I mean, you've got them, but if you look at
Well, I have them
the,
on Kindle, and now I really want them in print.
yeah, and then the graphics, it's not going to show really great, but like they each cover has a different color
Oh, that's
on
cool.
in the art design. So that actually is a combination, and then the back here will have
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't even know that they had that because of the Kindle. That's awesome.
I know most of them get read on KU. They're really pretty books. So I'm biased, but anyway, I actually had, so Tatiana did the art, and then a gentleman named Eric C. Wilder did the layout and
Mm.
the design. And he came up with, I kind of told him that I wanted the runes and like the
Oh, that's
wheel,
cool.
and he did the rest of it. And so, and he just knows what he's doing.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
designed the spines and everything. And so yeah, I can't really take credit for that, but I have seen just some stunning sets of books where like there's an illustration across the
Yeah.
spine, color splash. I mean, people are, whew, they're doing awesome stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my friend Mark Timoney, like he just redid his book one and then his novella and like got a new logo, did the same thing. He's like, well, when people, and I thought it was a gorgeous book. He had like Felix Ortiz do the cover, but he had a couple
Oh,
people, I can't remember if it was Felix or who did his logo, or if it was like Sean T. King. Totally blanking now, but I mean, it looks really good. So I grabbed the
yeah.
novella. He did like a Kickstarter, and I was just like, and that's another thing that I think is interesting with yours. Like, I just think I've seen people do, like oh why am I blanking on everybody's name today? One
The
of
dude,
Ben Galley.
whatever.
Ben Galley did like the unwritten. So I don't know if you've seen, but oh my gosh, talk about a beautiful book.
Yeah,
We're
gorgeous. I put
yeah,
another
it's
one up on
amazing.
Twitter yesterday or something.
Yeah, yep. I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to. Well, he said it at the end. He was thinking about doing like the trilogy set, and I was like, well, I already missed
Oh, no.
one because I leave so much room in my budget for like for my own stuff, but like for
Yeah.
like people like you if you're on Kickstarter or something, or if I just really want the physical copies, but particularly with Kickstarter
Sure.
because a lot of people I knew were doing it. So I'm like, of course he came up last minute, and I was like, I'd already spent all my Kickstarter money on my friends and stuff. But he was saying when I had him on at end of season one that he was thinking about doing like a trilogy set and then like the whole set. And I was like, I would have to get the whole set because yeah, those are cool. But yeah, people are doing some really cool things. But Yeah, yours look really great. So now I'm gonna have to go and do the wax. I try not to because like we're running out of room, but I
Yeah, it's hard.
you know,
It's
there's some you just have to have. My wife says it to me all the time. She's like, "Oh, I know what I said," but she's like, "This book just like we saw one the other day, and it just looks so beautiful." She's like, "We just have to get this," and I'm getting new shelves and stuff. So I was like, "Well, some can go above the shelf, and kind of look good, and kind of sit like getting those little wire library shelf kind of things."
yeah, yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, I was like redoing all of my statistics because at first I was like, oh, I'm just gonna Photoshop. Then I saw yours. I was like, nope, we're going back to Illustrated. Kind of looking at me like, what? I was like, these look so good
It's
though. So
tough. Yeah. And like now, if I were doing my covers now, just fantasy romance has gone in the direction of discrete covers. Do you know what I
mm,
mean?
yeah, 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 yeah.
The vines and the
Yep,
axe
yep.
symbols, and so I might not even do the same thing if I was
Yeah,
doing it now. It's so tough. It's
yeah.
so hard to follow the trends and
Yeah, it's
make.
hard because you're so far out, like that's like I had a friend ask me about because I have these novellas that I'm doing, which are like three parts. We're gonna put them together if people want, like a bigger one. Because we're only doing the Audible as like the three
Mm,
novella set. And then I'm doing book one, but like we were talking about the other day and we saw some people that we really liked, and I'm like, but at the same time, it's like that style, 6 months from now could be totally different. And it's hard because you got to do it
yeah.
relatively, far out, obviously. Yeah. So I've talked to people about that all the time. And I don't think we talk about that enough on here. So, like, yeah. So we talked about like maybe getting somebody in January, like talking about them with them, like what we're going to do and hook them by January, but then, not have anything done, till like end of February. I feel like it's really hard now. Like we were talking about before we got recording, like with matching things up. It's like, and a lot of people are working multiple jobs, as well as, being an author or an editor or, cover artist. So it's just like things are crazy. But well, those look great. I'm really jealous. And that leads me actually to the third question, which I'm really interested about, particularly after reading your reviews. How do you go about your world building process?
Um, well, yeah, so
Like, do you start with the world and something like I know I like particularly art and I like certain characters, and then I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then I kind of start to put them in a country and I kind of world built that way, like different countries, particularly early on. So I was just curious. Like, I know some people start with character, some people start with story and then kind of fill in the world. So other people start with the world first. So I was kind of just curious at like where you start in particular.
yeah, so typically I'm gonna see something in a book I read or a
Mm,
show I watch, or just it'll be a scenario. Like it might be a question, or it might be the premise of a show, or it might be a particular character with a particular trait, and it'll just kind of spark something. And then I do tend to immediately go romantic in my plots because it's what I enjoy reading and I
sure.
like. So then typically there'll be a second character, and the world building, it's hard because this is one series that I've done and it's a long one. It's a 6 book series, so I haven't done world building multiple times to be
Yeah,
able to
yeah.
claim that I have a system. I pulled a lot of influences into my world building from things like Western astrology
Mm.
and sure, a little bit of like the Avatar the Last Airbender stuff, which you can't avoid if you write if you write um a sorry, words just like fall out of my head. um,
Like the
if
elemental stuff, it's
yes,
kind of
thank
hard.
you.
Yeah.
Mental magic system, you're gonna get compared to Avatar because people think that they were the first ones that did it. But yeah, so I I I took all those influences and I thought about things like, okay, how does geography affect people? Like I
Mhm.
particularly world build through the language that I use. So like and it's a pet peeve of mine in other people's writing. if if you are in a Mediterranean country and you use euphemisms, probably they need to refer to things that would actually be
Oh
in like
yeah.
any country. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
it's little simple things like that. Or like if my religion is based on this wheel, I'm probably not going to say, oh God, because I don't have gods. Or, you know, like in my magic, the element it isn't just their magic, it affects their entire personality, like how they go about in the world. So basically, I just ask myself questions like, if this is your background, if you grew up with this, where would you, and you take into account human nature. Unfortunately, we have some things that we tend to do. We tend to discriminate. We tend to, you know, try to be better than other people by making traits of different types of people less or more. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
In things like that, and it's just it's kind of a constant stream of asking yourself questions. If I if I went in whatever I write next, I definitely will be more organized about it. Like most of it just in my head for these books. Like, so I would definitely write it down.
The good old encyclopedia.
Yeah, exactly. The book Bible that like more organized people have, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I tried doing that before I wrote my fantasy series, and I was like, I like got 3 months in, and I was like, this is so stupid. I was like, I might as well just, have it started, and then anytime I add something, then go add it. I was like, I was
That's
getting no writing done.
I the problem I'm running now is like, have I used this name
Mm.
before
Oh,
for these side characters? Because I never write them down. And so, you know,
I never thought of that. That's actually a really good idea. I never thought of doing that. I should probably do
yeah,
that.
because you, especially if you're writing a bigger, longer series, you're
Yeah.
out of side character names real quick.
Yeah, yeah. And you're like, oh, this sounds good, but it probably sounds good because you used it before.
Yeah,
That's a
exactly.
good
This one
point.
doesn't seem like I use it, and then he used it for three different people. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good point.
but
That actually threw me out of a book the other day. I was like going along, and then I think I'm in like book 5 of this series. Yeah, book five or six. And the author did that without intending to. And I was like, oh, so and so just showed up now. And then I was like, I had to like ask my friend who had read the series. He goes, nah, they just used the same name twice, like book 2 and book 6.
yeah,
Like, oh, okay. I was like, it totally threw me off. But I could see where, yeah, I never thought of that before. That's a really good gem out of
in
today. Yeah, that's a good idea.
back through and read all this stuff so that I know which names I've used, you know. Other could get bad real fast.
That's fair. Yeah. That's
Uh,
awesome. Well, I think that's yeah, I like how you said how I like how you stated that though, like in terms of, like asking yourself questions and, putting yourself in that scenario. That seems like a very easy thing that everybody would do, but as somebody that's world building their fourth different world, fifth, I don't know. Like I don't know why I didn't consider doing that. That seems like a very simple thing to do, but
well,
until somebody else says it, I don't do it. So that's stated
it's
really well.
it all works differently. Some people will fill out a whole questionnaire and character profile, like, and part of mine comes from so one of the things that I did in the army was I was in special operations,
Mm,
and I did civil affairs, which is
mm.
you know, it's like counterinsurgency.
Oh,
So
cool.
you do like stabilization kind of operations, right? So things like building up schools and making sure villages have wells and stuff like that. And one of the things you have to think about when you do things like that is what are called second and third order effects. And
Mm,
so I build this well, and what is the next ring out that's going to happen, and what is the next ring out from that that's going to happen, or if I take this thing away, or if I give this resource to this place, what's that ripple effect that happens? Is it positive? Is it negative? Does it give them something else to fight over? Does it unfairly weight the balance in favor of people that are problematic? Like, so those sorts of questions are things that I learned to ask in my job.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then that's the same kind of thing you want to ask in your world building. If I have this religion and that these people prescribe to this particular kind of thought pattern, what does that mean in their interactions or in their speech or in the way that they interact with their world and their
Mm.
neighbor, that kind of stuff. And that's what gives you, I think, it's an important part, and I think a more mature part of world building is that you're not just thinking in that first ring of
Yeah.
effect, you're thinking, and you can see it in things like Game of Thrones and Cradle and Sanderson, and the big names do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's the first level world building. It's like several deep.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good way to put it. I think that's why I always like the Forgotten Realms books and Dragonlance so much, was that like, it was like a core group of people took the rules and the maps, and then, obviously they did that, really in depth and added to it. And I think that's what makes those, worlds, and Star Wars, like I know George Lucas up until a certain point, I think it was up until like it was up until Attack of the Clones, episode 2, he would, anything that passed his desk, everything had to pass him, and he would read everything, sign off. There was a Yoda card back in the early 90s with a bunch of little Yodas like worshiping like a bigger Yoda statue, and it's
Yeah.
very famous because Hasbro published it without his approval, and he said, I never said anything about multiple, of his race. And then
Yeah.
Yaddle came out like 2 weeks later in Attack of the Clones.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, I think you make a good point when you're doing it that way. Brian Staveley talks about how he added ice to, one of his, areas that's like a Mediterranean, spot. And he's like, well, how on earth, did
Where's
the
that
ice
coming
get there? Yeah. And
from?
that like led to all these other questions. And he ended
Yeah.
up working with like a lumbering crew. And I was like, that just is so interesting. Like, in a fantasy setting, to think about. And those are the kind of the things I find most interesting about fantasy. And that's why I like to read fantasy and sci-fi more than,
And I think that's true of people that really like an epic read. They
yeah,
love that
yes.
feeling of wonder and that
Yep.
discovery and the depth of a culture that they're learning about,
Yep.
and so, and I actually, one of the examples that I use that I love is in video gaming, and it's BioWare,
Mm.
Effect, and Dragon Age. The
Oh yeah.
stories in those games are really deep and
Yeah,
incredible,
yeah.
and it's one of the reasons people love them so much.
Hmm.
There's just so much there,
Yeah.
So I think that it's true of reading as well.
Yeah. No.
Everybody, not everybody loves a big, deep, gritty epic.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Some people like a quick little adventure.
Yeah.
Yep. I think that's the hard thing now is like, you're either like, we were just talking to another friend of mine about this, who like he's trying to do the same thing with, with like, I like the Iron Druid Chronicles, by Kevin Hearn. Kevin's a good guy. I met him a few times and talked to him a lot online. And, like I love those urban fantasies, the Patricia Briggs, they're written really well, but it's like you can just feel, even though they're not the thickest books, it's like, particularly with Patricia, I feel like there's just so much there that anytime like the new one's coming out actually like this week, and my friend and I are so excited because we'll just fly through them, but we go back and reread them, and and it's fun for us, to go back and to see the second or third or fourth ring, as you said, and her Alpha and Omega series, the last one was like one of the best books I've ever read in my life. Can't wait to actually go back and reread that one.
Yeah,
But
you can feel,
so,
even if the author's not necessarily saying it all right there,
yep.
you can feel that there's like depth to what's
Yeah.
happening. I love that as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, it's like swimming in a like an adult pool versus a kiddie pool.
Yeah.
I just think, yeah, I think if it's not your thing, that's one thing, but if it is your thing, it's like, yeah, that's definitely
Yeah,
my kind of thing.
recognizing why a reader is picking up a book, not necessarily judging why, knowing that
Yeah.
if I'm a fantasy reader, I'm an epic fantasy reader because I like this depth,
Yep.
right? But if I'm a YA fantasy reader or an urban fantasy reader, I like a faster pace.
Yeah.
And so I'm probably not going to enjoy a big, chonky epic as much as I will something with the pacing that I prefer, and I think it's just a matter of what am I writing? Who am I marketing that to,
Oh yeah.
and it's just like tropes, right?
Mm.
You've
Yeah.
got understand what your readers want in their tropes. and
Yeah.
and especially in the romance genre, you have to be
Yeah.
a master. So yeah.
I had Heather Smith on last year for a 2-part episode. We talked a lot about that for February. She wrote, and it was like, and then I hadn't really considered it, and then like the more I talked to, authors of your genre, and I was like, oh, okay. I was like, well, this makes total sense though, because even if you're doing fantasy or sci-fi, now I feel like in particular when you're doing romance with those two, like you definitely have to have them down because I feel like you're not just doing one thing, you're doing two. So I feel like you got to be really, really precise, in your audience and the tropes. So yeah, that just opened up a whole new world of thinking about, tropes in particular for me.
Yeah.
I just hadn't really realized some of the things I was reading, why I like those things, or those people or those characters. So
Yeah, I think in other genres outside of romance, tropes are sometimes trope is used in a negative kind of connotation.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas if you're reading romance, you're typically reading it because of the familiarity of it,
Yeah, yeah.
And so tropes are like guideposts, they're comfort mechanisms.
Yeah.
Like, I know I'm in the mood for whatever, a biker romance, or I want the morally gray hero, or those are signposts for
Yeah.
you to kind of familiar experience that you want. Whereas if you're not reading romance, maybe you're more wanting to read to be surprised or to
Yeah.
have something subverted or whatever it is. I've said this in a somewhere else, but one of the things I've seen is that a lot of people that read romance, I've seen this a few times, they actually read it because they have anxiety or they have some
Hmm.
kind of trauma or they have some kind of PTSD, and the familiarity and the comfort of knowing that at the end, no matter what these characters go through, there's going to be like a happy ending.
Yeah, yeah.
It makes them feel safe, to read this, and it's not going to stress them out, and they can kind of dip their toe in the waters and be all right. It's
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
water things. And so I think just keeping those things in mind, whoever your audience is, just
Yeah.
know.
I think that is the hard thing just in general with any book, right? Or series, is that like we talk about this a lot. And I hear this on a lot of podcasts, like trying to stick with the familiarity, like the Dresden Files, like I feel like a lot of people get turned off by them early because, I would say like the first 5 books, 6 books are, you know, they're written with the same mechanisms.
Yeah.
And really not until book 7 or 8 does he diverge, and it starts to almost become an epic fantasy, an epic urban fantasy rather than just your typical. And that's like Kevin Hearn. Like I like those books because you were able to find the familiarity, and Patricia Briggs too, with both of them. Like you're able to find the familiarity, but they give you a new story. And I like it because they do twists and turns and all sorts of things. And you're never sure what to expect. Like with Patricia Briggs' new book, with her Mercy Thompson series, I have no idea what's going to happen next, even after reading,
It's
all the
just,
other books in the blurb. But I just think I look at the romance genre in particular, and I find the formula so interesting. And I also find that so many romance authors that I know do so well in romance, particularly when they find their audience. And
mhm,
to me, I'm like, well, how can you replicate that? Because the other day I was like, oh, I got done with this book and I was like, I want another book like this.
yeah,
Well, I have all these books on my shelf, all these fantasy books, but I don't know whose book is like that.
right,
And I'm like, I
exactly.
talk to authors all the time. So if I don't know, I'm
Yeah.
like, how on earth do the readers know? Or how
Yeah.
does me as a reader know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just there's some sort of that's why my friend he's like, well, there's like a disconnect there that we got to get figured out. I'm like, I agree. And I think if you can figure out that disconnect better, I think that everybody will, sell more books. And I like when I buy a book, I like buy one, I like one. I got done with HM Longs yesterday and I was like, okay, so I had to go immediately to somebody else's book because I can't ever like go, back to back in a series. I like to have a little bit,
Sure.
otherwise I get burnt out. That's what I did with the Dresden Files. I just went 7 books and I got burnt out. It took me like 2 years to return. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think it'll be interesting to see if people can, I think a lot of people don't look at the romance genre from fantasy or sci-fi. I don't think a lot of people look at it. I think they look at it as it's separate, which it is, like we were talking about. But I think that, I think there's a lot of cross pollination for
Mhm.
readers that doesn't happen, and I think that's why in particular, like, I've talked to a lot of people about a Star Wars type, world building where it's a, fantasy that looks like a sci-fi, because you can
Yeah.
kind of dip in both pools. I said it's the same thing when you're talking about, I think when you're talking about romance, fantasy or, sci-fi. And I ruined some people's day, some misogynistic guys, because I'm like, what? I was like, Indiana Jones. I was like, give me anything. They're like, Indiana Jones. I was like, Indiana Jones is a romance. Next. And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, Star Wars next. Like, I was like,
Yeah.
how can you take a good story and take the romance out of it? I said, it's not going to be as good of a story after that. So I was like, a lot of things that, The Witcher, is another one, with Yennefer and stuff. And
Add a whole other tension. Yeah.
yeah, I'm like Game of Thrones. There you go. That's a romance.
Yeah, well, and I mean, no, but yeah, that will they, won't they, and
Yep.
what effect will it have on the story if they
Yeah.
do, that stuff. It creates, if two people bang in the story and they need each other to finish some quest, and then they hate each other because they banged or whatever, that's tension
Yeah.
um that improves the story and drags you along. But anyway, don't get me started defending romance. It'll take up the rest of the pod.
I'm doing a panel later on this winter, with this, just romance authors,
Nice.
who particularly are the fantasy and sci-fi genre. So I'll invite you to that one, and we'll go off all day. But
Absolutely.
yeah, I just think it's interesting because as an author, I'm like, I will never not learn from somebody, from a genre. I'm like, especially one that's been so popular as romance, and so. I'm like, I saw a couple of numbers from some people, and I was like, holy moly. And I'm like, fine. I was like, these other guys in particular can not learn from, you authors. And I was like, I'll just learn. And I was like, we'll just all have fun over here together with people reading our books. And
Yeah, you know what? Joke. Joke is that, oh, you don't like my romance because it's not good writing. Well, I'll just go cry into my piles of money.
yeah. Well, I'm like, well, that's like, okay, just real fast, because that drives me nuts. Because like my mom has probably read every Danielle Steele book
Mhm.
ever, and she really likes Danielle Steele, and I'm like, she just got like whatever the newest one was, and I was like, how was it, because I've grown up. I mean, she like got me into reading, and I've seen her read them for my entire life, and I'm like, the fact that you're still reading those after 34 years, is a really big deal to me as an author. I'm like, I want to do that. I'm like, how do I do that? And I think if you discount people that have read that many books, from one author in 30-year time, I'm like, I don't know how you discount that as not good writing, whether or not it's whatever genre. It's
Yeah.
like people that don't like Lewis L'Amour. I'm like, okay, you don't like him because he's a Western author, but you got to admit, he sold a lot of books, and a lot
Yeah,
of people
what's
enjoyed him.
funny is that I learned to read late. I learned in second grade. And but then I just took off, right? I was a complete um reading fiend. Sorry, my kids walking. Um and my dad was a big Louis L'Amour guy, and
Mm.
those are the books that I read for, like, the first adult books I read were Louis
Oh,
L'Amour.
that's cool.
All of them.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll see him on, like we'll go randomly to like a hotel or something. I'll see him there, and I'm like, my wife's like, "Do you read that one? Do you read that one?" Because he used to read with my grandfather back in the day. He's a big Western guy, and
Oh,
my
nice.
dad did too. So yeah, like other kids, got read, Good Night Moon. I was reading, getting read Louis
Yeah,
L'Amour or Lonesome Dove, one of those.
it's, yep, all that kind of stuff. Yep.
Oh, that's funny. Well, are there any tools, or well, you kind of already talked about like your strategies, like in terms of world building, but in terms of your magic system, it just sounds really interesting. So, were there any particular tools or strategies that you used to create that magic system? I love the
Um,
wheel concept.
I know.
That's fine too.
So I knew that I wanted an elemental magic system, and I knew that I wanted a series, and I got the idea that I wanted each book to be a particular one of these elements,
Oh,
right?
that's cool.
Typically in Western, um, in Western, like Greek myth, there's the four elements, you know them all, right? And I just kind of wanted to mix it up a little bit. I'm not the first person that did this, I'm not going to pretend, but I added in creation and destruction because I knew I liked the idea of balance.
Hmm.
And I grew up with a hippie for a mom, and she was really into Western astrology. And so I grew up reading all these astrology books, and there's a lot of really interesting concepts. And what
Oh
I
yeah.
did go with the Chinese elements because they do wood and metal, and it didn't spark uh, exactly what I wanted with the
Yeah.
balancing. So I went with Western, and in Western astrology, each sign has its own element, and well, not its own element, but they're grouped by elements.
Okay.
And they are also, it really governs your personality, and
Yeah.
there's things about fixed or mutable, and the stubbornness of people and how flexible they are, and whether people interact well if their elements are in opposition. Like I took
Oh, that's
all that
interesting.
stuff, yeah, and I put it into my magic system. And so I have this wheel, and people are opposite on the wheel, or they're in harmony on the wheel, which means they're
Oh,
next to
that's
each other.
cool.
And I used that to define like how their magic interacted, how they interacted, what their personalities were like. Like Naomi, the main female character in my first book, Rain and Ruin, is an air mage, and she's very intellectual, and she's very closed off emotionally, and she's very stoic. And but you have other characters like water mages are very emotional and kind of more sensual. And I mean, they're all different people, but those things are involved in how they relate to the world.
Mm.
And so I don't know that I have a system or tools that I use, but it's just the same thing for world building. I ask myself questions like, if this, then that, or if this, but, or what if, and you have
Yeah.
to take it to its logical conclusion. And then some of that stuff, because I am a pantser, I have to answer questions when I write myself into corners.
Oh yeah. I
And
know
so
that feeling.
yeah, so you have to kind of, and I like that. I like working within the rules I created. But yeah, sometimes it does cause some tears and gnashing of teeth. Like, whose idea was this? This was a terrible idea. Why did I come up with this?
Yep.
Uh,
Well, that sounds very interesting. I'm thinking particularly within the romance genre, like what you got there seems like I'm just seeing like conflict resolution. Like it
yeah,
just seems like you have natural, you got a lot naturally there within the magic system in the world, where it's like already built in. So
yeah,
I'm like,
exactly.
dang it, that's a really good idea. Why can't I be that smart? Like I've I've not done that. Like, that's really cool. Well, I think it's interesting, when you're talking about like, Western astrology and things, I've really like certain things, particularly, well, it's funny that you mentioned, like Chinese astrology, but like, I looked at a lot of that too, and then I went more with a philosophy turn, I guess. But I'm still playing with some things. But yeah, they got a lot of interesting, what I thought would be interesting character concepts or interesting world building.
Yeah,
And I don't think that you could ever look at any of those and not be like, oh, that's like a perfect, map for, you could just change a couple things into those settings. I mean, I think that that is like a genius way to go about it, but it's a lot easier to kind of go from there, I think, than to go from scratch. Uh,
yeah.
yeah.
And I just, I don't know. It's people say going from scratch, but you're never really going from scratch.
No,
You're
it's
going
totally true. Yeah.
from wherever you were raised and
Yep.
whatever cultural things are and whatever you've been exposed to. And it
Yep.
may seem like you're from scratch, but like I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel. And I don't mean that in the copying or plagiarizing way. I just mean like there's all this stuff out there. And they're really great stepping off points for your own ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, that should totally be your autobiography, not reinventing the wheel. And then you could like have your wheel on the cover. Like that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested with this question now. Well, we
Okay.
talked in terms of like, your characters and things like that. So when it comes to your characters, what do you find is most important when making them feel real? I feel like a lot of people I saw your reviews, like, that seemed to maybe if they didn't necessarily say it, like they clearly like the character your characters clearly felt real to them. So I was just curious on like how you went about that because sometimes certain characters appear flat or this would I would never meet this person, but it seemed like from your a lot of your reviews like a lot of people were very emotional. So clearly you made your characters feel real to them. So I was just curious about that.
Um, so, I'm I'm a mom and I was in the army and I'm 40, and so I have moved past a little bit the age where, and now don't get me wrong, I read all the stuff, the Chosen One and the
Yeah.
superpower stuff, and I loved it and I ate it up. And honestly, I wish I still loved it and ate it
Yeah.
up. But you get to an age where you realize how very human and very flawed you are, you know? And everybody is human and flawed. Even the people that you're like, man, I would pay to spend a day in that person's shoes. You know
Yeah.
what? Some shit
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
And I wanted to read about people that, yeah, they're extraordinary. They're mages, they have super cool magic, but like at the same time, you know, Naomi is she's written by somebody that was in the army and experienced a great deal of misogyny, right? So I wanted to reflect my experience in being a woman in a male career. And I wanted to create for her somebody that did not need to dominate, but who could recognize that she was the appropriate person for the job.
Oh, what just happened? Oh, you talked. Just like kick. It's really weird. Hmm. It's very interesting.
Okay.
That was really weird. I've never seen it do that before. It like froze me and I couldn't do anything.
Yeah, that's
It like acted like it was gonna kick me off and then it didn't. It was really weird.
all right. Can you see me and hear me?
Yep, yep, yep,
Okay.
perfectly.
Okay. So it's not about necessarily all the things in the plot of it is, but what really matters is what's happening internally with the character. And to have that be have tension or have people able to connect with the character, they have to have flaws. They
Yeah.
can't be perfect. And I mean, that's all that I did. It sounds really
Mm.
simple, but then it isn't, you know, in practice. But
That's
and I
writing,
don't
right?
mean like, oh, they have a limp or oh, their hair is frizzy, you know, not like that kind of stuff. They have to be like humans with issues. Like Naomi, my character is she's intellectual and she's reserved and she is trying to prove that she can do, you know, rule things. And so she takes everything and takes it on and doesn't talk about it and doesn't share it and doesn't, you know, until finally she breaks. And that's a pretty real, you know, scenario. Or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
um I have in book 3, my main female character had a really traumatic thing happen to her as a kid, and some people argue that she held on to it too much, but I don't think so. You know, you have to really commit to this stuff. But I think it's that I if you're writing people, humans, and you're writing an epic fantasy, you have so much playground to write people that are not perfect. And
Yeah, yeah.
since nobody else, no real people are perfect, they will connect with that, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it is
So,
funny that you mentioned that, in terms of people holding on to things for too long. I've heard somebody say that the other day about a friend of mine, and well, well, how can you say that? Because you didn't have that traumatic event happen to you, or that event happen. I was like, everybody deals with it in different ways. It's
exactly.
different. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that I think that makes total sense.
Yeah.
What is one writing tool that you or strategy that you would want to use, maybe try in the future, like maybe with a different series, or it could be anything really.
Um, yeah, I, you know, I wrote this series very much. There is actually a line between what authors like me call fantasy romance and romantic fantasy.
Oh, interesting.
And mine definitely fall into fantasy romance. Each book has a standalone romance with an overarching plot. That's very common in paranormal romance and
Mm.
contemporary romance, where you have like a small town series and it's the same town but different couples. And
Mm.
so mine are written like that. But I would probably like to do something more that's probably a bit more leaning in the epic direction or
Mm.
romantic fantasy, where I have maybe 2 or 3 books at most. I'm never doing a 6-book series again. That's the same couple if I choose to put romance into it through the
Mm.
series, because I love big, epic, world changing stories. That's what I
Yeah.
like to read. And I discovered what I like to write, you know, because when I've written a couple of the quieter stories in this series, they've been harder for me.
Yeah.
um Rain and Ruin was easier for me because it's the big like kingdoms converging and you know that kind of thing, and I like that. So probably I'd go more romantic fantasy or even
Mm.
just epic fantasy with a side plot kind of thing.
Oh, that's cool. That's very
Yeah.
interesting. Hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, for that last one, do you have any news, updates, promos, anything like that that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I wish. I've got a lot of people that are waiting on my book 4. I have written 4 books, but one is a prequel, and I am working on book 4, which is Ice and Ivy. I I'm trying so hard to get it out by the end of the year. But is this your first kid that your wife's about to
Yeah,
have?
which is why I'm like doing all of season 2 before
Yeah,
October.
no, it's great. I did not plan that
Oh,
way for book 2, for kid 2. And so I'm now on, I'm going to say, a 2-year hiatus,
Mm.
and I would really like to be done with that, but small kids are hard. They're just hard. So
Yeah, that's why
they
I
take a
like
lot.
pre-planning. My
Good for
friend's like,
you.
he's
Yeah,
like,
good
he's like,
job.
he's like, you're gonna have all these done by January. I was like, 3 prequel novellas, and then my first book for my urban fantasy. I was like, yep. I was like, because we don't
Uh-huh.
have a choice. I was like, I can
Yeah.
pick that date, so we can't pick when they come. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. And you're just so fried, and that sleep deprivation, that is brutal. That I'm not gonna lie,
That's
it
why the
really messes
military
up your
does it,
brain.
right? Like to train you because it is brutal. And I feel
Well,
like my
they do, but it's just not the same. It
yeah.
isn't the same. They have like codes of decency and ethics, like
Those
medical
kids have
things.
none. Yeah.
Kids don't care.
That's why
Yeah.
I said to my friend, he's like, "Why are you doing this right now?" I said, "I'm gonna be busy for the next 18 years." So I was like,
Yeah.
we went everywhere. We did everything this summer, that we could, and and I'm like, I was like, we just figured, you might as well do it now because you're probably not gonna have time later. So
It's good thinking. Yeah, you
yeah.
gotta. Yeah, I should have known better because when I started writing this series when my oldest was he just about hit 2, and
Mm.
that's about when I started to feel like myself again. And so I should have known that it would take that long, but I was completely delusional about what when I was going to pop back on the riding horse. So it's been that plus COVID and just
Yeah,
all of
yeah.
the stuff, so whatever.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm working on book 4. I don't have any good dates or any fun.
That's fine. When you do come back, and we'll get it out to everybody, ahead of
Yes.
time, and
Yeah.
get it out there. So, but that's cool though, because I know a lot of people have said to me recently, like, "Well, I just at least want a trilogy to read," and I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "Well, that's a lot better than being like, oh, the whole series has to be done." I'm like, "I don't know." I'm like, "I
Yeah.
don't do that. I read what I like, and then I'll come back to it." I'm like, or I'll go,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm like, I
I'm
don't
the
ever
same
wait
way.
till I read. Yeah,
I
exactly.
get waiting because I also like to binge a shorter
Okay,
series,
yeah, yeah.
but I get it, but I just kind of read whatever I'm in the mood for,
Yeah,
whether
yeah. I used to do that though. Like I used to like wait, and then I used to read a lot of R.A. Salvatore, and then I'd get all
great
the way
books.
done. Yeah, to get all the way done. Now I'm like, I just want to be done because I know I'm just gonna finish one right after another. So that is one series where I was like, I'll just wait till he's like done, and then
Yeah.
I'll go from there. So I do. My friend, he's like, you're such a, you do understand that feeling. I'm like, I do, but I'm like for other things though. I'm like to be fair, he's on like his 70th book right now, so.
Yes.
Well, we just want to remind our audience that Jen's books can be found in her description. So her website will be right at the top. Amazon will be right there. If you've been with us for a while, you know how it goes. We'll have Goodreads and her socials and things like that in there as well. Just make sure, we're really stressing season 2. Please make sure, for any author, but particularly indie, that you were going and reviewing books. I know that's how I get a lot of recommendations, particularly on Goodreads, when it pops up, or Amazon in particular. So it helps the algorithm and helps those people out. So if you want to be like me and read their books and get more of them, you need to review the ones that they've already written. So please, please, please make sure you've done that. If you want to drop Jen a line, feel free. If you, get scared of meeting celebrities, message me and we will pass on, any comments, questions, or things like that for her. Jen, thank you so much for coming. I was just really excited to see your books online, and I was like, oh man, those look really great. And I was looking, and doing some research, and I was really glad to, have you on today. I did not want to reschedule, so I was so happy that
Well,
I
thank
can
you
get to
so
talk
much
to
for
you.
the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun. I
Yeah.
appreciate the chat.
Yeah. Anytime you want to, come and chat about, romance or
Absolutely.
fantasy or a blend, or, just, get away from the family and talk about writing, you let me know, and, we'll schedule a time. I know my wife is so excited that, kind of get this out of my system today. Especially, nearing a completion of a novella. I'm just been, excited. So yeah, anytime you want to come and chat, you just drop me a line and we'll get you
Awesome.
on. And I'll make sure I have you down on my list for our romance panel. So I will
Yeah.
be sending out those dates. We'll be doing those before my baby's born. So November and
Fingers
December.
crossed.
So yeah, exactly. Definitely before December. So that way we can get you on, and yeah, we'll have a nice talk then. And I know you'll enjoy talking to some of the other people like Heather Smith. I think Susanna Evans said that she'd be on there. And then I got one more that will be joining us as well. So it'll be a good time. So I think it'll be
Very
a really
cool.
good one.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jen. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and I will talk to you soon.
You too. All right. Thanks.
See you later.
Bye.